Is the sound okay if I stand over here? Cool, awesome. Yeah, I'll be talking about some work that I've been doing with Marcel Matar and Guillaume Henneken for my PhD, where we've been training agents to learn when and how to think and trying to relate that to human behavior and neural representations. And then for the second part of the talk, I'll talk more about some recent work I've done in my postdoc with Tim Behrens, where we've really tried to get at kind of a mechanistic understanding of how planning can unfold in prefrontal cortex. And that part is very preliminary, but I thought this would be a good forum to share ideas and get feedback. And so just to motivate briefly, I just get this to work. Okay, cool. Right, we know that we think and people think, and maybe, but probably animals also think. And so here's an imagined scenario where you're this agent, right, trying to navigate an environment. And for this talk, we'll just assume that you have access to a model of the world. And if you have that, then you can try to simulate different possible action sequences. So you might imagine, going up here and realize that that takes you to some boring state you don't care about. And then you might imagine going kind of to the right and realize you get to this £1 coin, which you want. And so you decide to go to the right. And so to try to get at this kind of thing experimentally, we took a bunch of people online and we made them solve a navigation task similar to this imagined example, where basically the agent is this blue dot and it has to get to this hidden goal location. You'll notice the boundaries here are periodic, so you can move through. And eventually you find the goal, and that's great. And we teleport you to a different random location, and now we have to return to the goal. And you have to do this as many times as possible in 20 seconds. And so this means there's some kind of trade-off between thinking and acting. Because if you think for longer, you're likely to compute a better policy, and so make better decisions. But also it uses some of your time, right? And so you have less time to actually go and collect reward. And we think this is kind of a major trade-off that's commonly the case in natural behaviors when you have to decide whether to think or to act in the world. And then eventually you do this as many times as possible, and then the environment changes, and you do the same thing with a new reward function and a new environment. And so we started by putting some people in this task online, and we tried to estimate how much time do they spend thinking before each action they take. And we find there's a distribution of thinking times, and this distribution has a lot of structure. So here I'm just going to plot it along two axes. The first one is we see if you just look at the first action within a trial, so you know where the goal is, you've just been teleported, how much time do you spend thinking before you press the key to move? We find that if you're far away from the goal, you spend a long time, and if you're near the goal, you don't spend very much time. And after this initial action, you spend less time thinking further along in the trial, right? So this is kind of consistent with our intuition that you might want to plan up front, and then once you've planned, you don't need to do as much later on, you just kind of correct your initial plan. And also this idea that planning longer trajectories takes longer time than planning short trajectories. And so we wanted to try to think about the possible mechanisms that could underlie this kind of behavior. And so to do that, we trained an agent in the spirit of this workshop. And our agent was a recurrent neural network trained in a meta-reinforcement learning setting in the spirit of Jin Wang and Seb Kurt-Nelson and colleagues at DeepMind. And the idea here is that you take a recurrent neural network and you give it inputs which correspond to the observations in the environment. And the output of the RNN is a policy, which is a distribution over actions you want to take. And so then you sample an action from this distribution, and that leads to a change in the environment. But in these classical settings, right, so one important thing to note here is that you're going to train it on a lot of environments with different configurations and reward functions, and then test it with frozen parameters in a new environment. And this adaptation has to happen within the recurrent network dynamics. It's like a fast timescale adaptation that doesn't update weights, but it updates neural activity in what we think of as being prefrontal cortex, this recurrent neural network. But usually when people do this, you get one observation and then you produce an action, and you get another observation, you produce an action. There's no way to do temporally extended thinking, right? You have to produce actions at regular intervals. And we thought, what happens if you take these classical models and you give them the option of thinking? And here we just come up with one possible version of thinking, which allows us to get at this question of when should you use this computation? What's the trade-off between doing additional computation and taking actions in the world? And so our definition of thinking here is to sample an action sequence from the policy of the agent, and then use a learned world model to predict the result of taking this action sequence and provide that as an input to the agent on the next time step. So now either you can move in the world, or you can imagine moving in the world and simulate that using a world model, a learned world model, and then take that information together with your observations from the environment to produce a new and improved policy. So why might you want to do that? One reason is that thinking is usually much faster than acting. And so to capture this, we assume that taking one physical action takes 400 milliseconds, or simulating one action sequence of up to 8 actions takes 120 milliseconds. And so on average, you can simulate about 20 actions in the time it takes to take one action. And so if simulating 20 actions, right, or simulating some number of actions makes your policies substantially better, that can kind of save you enough time by improving your policy that this is worth it. So we can train this agent, and we can look at, what happens when humans move around in this world. This is the goal location. And what happens when the agent moves around. They both solve the task. We see that the agent sometimes stops. We can ask what happens mechanistically kind of inside the agent when it stops, because this is an RNN we've trained. And we can see that it's simulating these trajectories that I've colored green if the agent predicts them to go to the goal, and blue if the agent predicts them to not go to the goal. And so the agent runs around and does these simulations. And we can now say, what is this good for, or is this good for anything? And to do that, we go and look at, I forgot a slide. First, we're just going to say, when does the agent choose to do this, right? This is like a metacognitive task. So when is it valuable to do this computation? And one way to ask that is just to say, we optimize the network to do it whenever it's best because it's optimized to maximize reward. And we find that kind of the patterns of when this model chooses to do additional computation really matches quite well when humans think it's valuable to do additional computation. And the reason that the agent does this is because doing more computation here along the x-axis leads to a better policy. So here we're asking, as a function of how many of these rollouts are being done at the beginning of a trial, how long is it going to take the agent to reach the goal? And we see that this is modifying the decreasing. And so, this is kind of in the spirit of these compute time, inference time scaling laws of transformers, right? This is really saying, if you're willing to spend more compute at inference time, then you can get better performance. How does this work mechanistically? Well, one way to get at this that we used is to try to categorize these different rollouts or like policy simulations into whether they were successful or unsuccessful according to the learned model of the agent, right? So does the agent think it goes to the goal or not? And it turns out if the agent thinks that this action sequence that's simulated goes to the goal, then it's going to upregulate the probability of taking that action sequence. This is the probability of taking the actions before the rollout and after the rollout, and it increases. Whereas if it simulates an action sequence that it predicts to be bad, it's going to say, well, actually, that was a bad idea. Let me not do that. And so this is how the policy is being updated using this computation. And again, just to reiterate, right, this kind of looks like standard policy gradient algorithms, which say, I'm going to take an agent, I'm going to make it do a bunch of different trajectories, perform a bunch of different trajectories, and then I'm going to update the weights such that the trajectory becomes more likely if it was better than expected, and less likely if it was worse than expected. So essentially, this agent has learned to implement a policy gradient-like algorithm, but not in the parameters which are fixed, instead in the hidden state of the network through this feedback from the mental simulation. And so one way to visualize this is you can say, for a given state of this network, right, a given hidden state or firing rate of all the neurons, you can compute in theory what is the expected reward if you interact with the environment from that initial condition, right? And that's going to live somewhere in this reward landscape. And what these rollouts do is they allow you to move to a different part of hidden state space, which has higher expected reward. And you can do another rollout and move to a different part of hidden state space that has higher expected reward. And again, we can compare this to what if you were to actually run a policy gradient algorithm, but where the substrate is not the weights, instead the firing rates. And we kind of find that these are correlated. And so we think one way to use kind of model simulation or imagine policy rollouts is to do reinforcement learning using policy gradients on imagined experience. And this is an algorithm that these RNNs can use. And we do some comparisons to representations in hippocampus in the paper, but I'm not going to talk about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about what's actually happening in the RNN, which is something we didn't look at that much in this previous work, but which is something I'm very interested in for my postdoc. And so one thing to note when I showed you guys this plot is that even with no rollout, so with no explicit simulation, the agent was already kind of reasonably good, right? It was way, way better than chance. And so these rollouts are not the only way it's doing decision making. It's more a policy refinement. So you have an RNN, which we think of as PFC, that's already doing some kind of computation using the learned structure of the world to compute a pretty good policy. And then you can do additional explicit search for policy refinement to improve your behavior. And what me and Tim and our colleagues are really interested in is what's happening in this kind of regime here. How does prefrontal cortex using this do this fast decision making based on the structure of the world? And so to answer this question, we take inspiration from the recent literature on sequence working memory. And I'm just going to explain very briefly and very schematically some recent results from Li-Ping Wang's lab and Tim's lab and Bushman's lab and other people. And I'm going to do this by contrasting it to hippocampal representations that we know and love. So if you're this mouse and you're trying to get to the cheese, we know what the hippocampal representation is going to look like, right? It's going to look like a place cell. So this cell just says, I'm active because the mouse is here. When the mouse moves, a new place cell is active because now you're here, right? And so on and so forth. So here you're representing one moment in time and your representation changes as you move. The representation that Tim and Mohammadi and Xi and Liping Wang have found in frontal cortex is different. It's representing the entire future simultaneously in one big neural population. So here you have, in the schematic, 9 neurons that represent where you are now, they're like place cells. Or you have 9 other neurons that represent where you're going to be next. They say, I'm going to be here after one action. And 9 other neurons that say where you're going to be after 2 actions. You're going to be down here. Right? And now when you move in the environment, this whole representation shifts. So it's up to date, right? This is still saying, where am I going to be next? I'm going to be here. But that's where I was going to be in 2 time steps before, right? It's like shifting to be in sync to where you are now. Okay, and this is what we think is happening in sequence working memory when I'm telling you the sequence of states you have to pass through. But we know frontal cortex also does planning. And so we hypothesize that the representations used for planning should be similar to the representations used for sequence working memory. And it turns out you can actually construct a planning algorithm very simply that operates in the space of these representations. And the end result of planning is to construct a representation like this one that tells you what you should do in the future. And the way to do this is to provide an input to this first subspace that says, where am I now? Because we know that's what we need to present. This could be input from hippocampus. An input to these remaining subspaces that say, where am I trying to go? What's the reward function of the world? We think this could come, for example, from OFC. And that's going to bias your future representation towards desirable states. And then recurrent connections between these neural populations that say which transitions are possible in the world. And that's kind of like saying, I need to start here, I need to get to the cheese, but I'm only allowed to take transitions that are possible, I can't teleport. And if you run this algorithm, starting from some initial random activity state here, right, it turns out that this will resolve your activity into a representation of the future path, because you've essentially constructed an attractor network where the fixed points of the attractor are solutions to the planning problem. Right, so you start from random activity, and you turn the handle of recurrent network dynamics, and you end up with a representation of your future plan that looks like these representations we know exist when you're doing sequence working memory. Cool, and so just for an analogy to something that's a bit simpler to understand, this is like the ring attractor networks that have been studied extensively by Vivek in the back and other people, right, where you build in a connectivity matrix into your neural population that says neurons that represent similar states or consistent states should be connected, and neurons representing inconsistent states should be inhibitory. And now if you start from some random neural activity pattern, this gets resolved into a consistent representation of a location of a ring. In the same way, this is slightly confusing, but we're building a neural network where the connections, say, excite representations that are consistent, right? This is locations that are adjacent in space and time, and inhibit locations that are inconsistent, being at 2 different locations at the same time. And now you end up with a set of fixed points that are consistent trajectories through space and time, and they're going to be biased by your reward function to solve this planning problem. Okay, so here's like a simulation of this algorithm doing some computation in practice. And so here again, you have kind of one subspace of neurons, right? These are a whole bunch of neurons that are all active at the same time, right? So you have one subspace of neurons that say, where am I now? And then these little neurons say, where should I be next? And after that, and so on and so forth. And this plane over here, I'm taking a max projection across all of these planes. And so it's like a summary of all the states I'm going to visit at some point in the future. And you can let these dynamics run, right? And initially activity spreads until slowly it converges to this fixed point of the dynamics, which, as we said, is a representation of where you should go in order to maximize reward. And now your policy is just to go to whichever state is being represented in the next subspace, right? These neurons just say, where do I want to be next? As you can immediately read out your policy, and eventually you get to the cheese and you're happy. So this seems slightly crazy, right? This is literally 500 neurons that I've used to solve a shortest path problem, which you know you can solve using simple algorithms like Dijkstra's algorithm or successor representations. So why on earth would you want to do that? Or is this just completely crazy? And one way to ask whether this is crazy, which has a rich history of success in neuroscience, is to train recurrent neural networks and see whether there are any conditions under which this is the solution that gradient descent finds with no other inductive biases. And that turns out to be the case, not if you're doing shortest path problems because they're easy, but if you're solving difficult planning problems where the reward can change in both space and time. And so how do we create a task like this? We create this, what we call the reward landscape task, which is a difficult task. This task has a different reward function here illustrated as a heat map at every point in time. So the color is the reward you get for taking an action that leads you to that state. And this changes across time. And the arrows indicate the optimal policy, which is not to go to the higher immediate reward state, but instead to go to the low immediate reward state, because you can then follow this path of high reward into the future. Cool. And so we can ask, if we train an RNN to do this, what representation is learned? And the way we're going to query the representation is using linear decoders, as we often do in neuroscience. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the neurons at time t equals 0, so when the agent is here, and we're going to try to predict where will the agent be in the future at this time, this time, at this time. Okay, and this blue line says we can do that. Then we take the neurons at, and importantly here, we train different decoders for every pair of neurons and time points. We can train a new decoder, taking the neurons at time t equals 1 and predicting the future. We can still predict the future. We can still predict the future at all times. And we can predict the future more than the past, right? This is not just a statistical quirk of the environment. Really, this is a learned representation of the future. We're then going to ask, what is the form of this representation? How does it generalize? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take the same decoder, like a particular decoder, the one that predicts location at time 3 from neurons at time 2, and say, what else does it predict? What else lives in this subspace? Right, so because we trained it to do so, it predicts location at time 3 from neurons at time 2. But the same decoder predicts location at time 2 from neurons at time 1, or location at time 4 from neurons at time 3, right, and so on and so forth. So you really have an invariant representation of where you're going to be one step in the future. You have the same thing for 2 steps in the future and 3 steps in the future. And so it really looks a lot like this representation we postulated in a handcrafted model, which has these invariant subspaces representing the future. We can then take neural activity in our RNN. Again, this RNN was just trained on a task, and we're trying to query the algorithm that is learned. We're going to take the high-dimensional neural activity, 1,000 dimensions here. We're going to project it into these subspaces that correspond to 1 step in the future and 2 steps in the future. And we're going to look at the dynamics. So this is like the simulation before, but now for the RNN instead of the handcrafted model. And we see it learns this kind of representation saying, where am I going to be in the future? And the dynamics slowly converge to a fixed point representing this plan, which the agent can then follow by reading out the policy in the upcoming subspace, right? So this is showing that the RNN learned a representation similar to the representation in the model we hypothesized on the basis of the frontal data. But it doesn't say that like the mechanism of the dynamics is the same. So to ask that, we're going to look at the actual connectivity learned by this RNN. And remember what we did in our handcrafted model. We said you need to have an input, which is where you are, an input in the future, which is your reward function, and recurrent connections, which is allows transitions. And we can look at the inputs to these different slots that we identified using our decoders. And these inputs are, this is a slightly confusing plot. It's quite recent. So the input from the agent gets location input, which is where are you? And that provides input to the initial slot saying, where am I now, right? This is what we predicted. And it also provides inputs to subsequent slots. And those inputs are basically powers of the transition matrix. So it's saying, where am I now? Where can I be next? And where can I be after that? And additionally, you get this reward input from the different reward functions, right? This is saying what's the reward at the next time step. And that inputs to this slot here saying, where do I want to be at the next time step? And so these connections, these input connections are basically biasing you towards starting where you are and going towards high reward locations. We can also look at the recurrent weights, which we wanted to be the transition function of the world. And indeed, if you look at the recurrent weights between adjacent slots, right, this looks like the transition matrix of the world, which is saying, while being biased towards high reward locations, I still need to have possible trajectories. This is just projecting the weight matrix into the space by time representation, saying this neuron connects to these 3 adjacent neurons, but just visualizing it a different way. Cool. So I'm running slightly out of time, so we're going to whisk through this, but we would really like to test these ideas experimentally, right? Like we think it's reasonable because it looks a bit like frontal representations, and also because RNNs learn it, so it's not completely crazy. But how can we test these attractor ideas? David Anderson told us the other day, we're going to do holography, right? We're going to do optogenetic stimulation together with Sandra Reinert in Tom Mersick-Flogel's lab, who are really good at doing these kinds of experiments. And the idea is we have predictions about the representations and activity. So we're going to put mice in a head fixed task. We're going to do 2 photon calcium imaging in medial prefrontal cortex to find out when these neurons are active, so where they live in this coordinate system. And then we can do optogenetic stimulation with single cell resolution and ask, when we stimulate this neuron in red, which neurons in green become active as a result. And this is going to allow us to test the ideas. And this is very much work in progress, but hopefully, in 2 or 3 years, we'll have answers to these questions. Cool. So finally, I'm just going to relate this back to the idea we had about this explicit mental search, right? This actually provides a potential algorithm for combining with this explicit search, because we have a system that is good at representing useful paths. So if you start from some initial representation, which is bad because it's trying to do wrong transitions or you haven't learned a good world model, you can now mentally simulate trajectories that you project back up to frontal cortex, and that can allow you to adjust the policy being represented in frontal cortex. And we think that the interaction between these explicit simulations in hippocampus and this kind of attractor network in prefrontal cortex allows you to do gradual policy improvement. And we also think hippocampal sequences can maybe be used to learn the weights necessary for this planning algorithm. I'm going to leave this maybe for the panel discussion. Why do we want to train these models? And in summary, I'm just going to say we know that frontal cortex does planning. We think this is happening using these space-time representations, and we're going to test that experimentally, right? And these plans that are being computed on a fast timescale in frontal cortex through a form of fast inference process can then be gradually updated using explicit search, for example, in hippocampus. And in fact, when we train networks of different sizes using these like a combination of an RNN and explicit policy rollouts, we find that these networks really do the most explicit search when they have small sizes and are at intermediate task performance, which is exactly the regime where you understand the task structure, so you might have a good model of the world, but you haven't really learned a good fast policy in prefrontal cortex, and so you refine it using explicit search. And then I just finally want to say thanks to everyone involved, Guillaume and Marcelo, who supervised this project on policy rollouts, Tim, who's my postdoc supervisor, together with Thomas Ackham, that we collaborate with a lot in Oxford, and finally Sandra Reinert, who's going to do a lot of these holography experiments. And thank you to the organizers and all of you for listening. Yeah. So it's going to take forever to click through. Anyways, okay, I'm not going to click through. So the agent chooses at every step whether to perform a rollout or not. It's just part of the policy. And we find empirically that they are more likely to do rollouts earlier than they are to do late. And the cost of the rollout is not explicit. We don't say you pay a reward cost. The only cost is the temporal opportunity cost of planning, right? So we've assumed that rollouts take time, but less time than physical actions. And it's like when we do normal planning, you don't want to think forever because you're never going to do anything. And we think this is like a real cost of planning in human and animal behavior, which is often not included in models in neuroscience, but which might be important. And this cost is sufficient to drive these behaviors that look like human behavior in the task that we're studying. Yeah? And for the prediction, based on you have a very specific pattern, animal feature experiment. The prediction is in the same way that like the prediction of the ring attractor theories was that you would have this really specific connectivity, like competition between neurons representing locations on a ring. We make a specific prediction about the connectivity between neurons representing locations in a plan. So I've schematized this as direct connections. They don't have to be direct. It could also be that you're doing hierarchical planning. This is kind of how things work in visual cortex, right? Like you have different cells representing simple features, and they effectively inhibit each other if these simple features are inconsistent and excite each other if they're consistent. But a lot of this comes via top-down prediction. So you see some simple features, you use that to infer a high-level object, and then that tells you what the simple feature should be. You could do the same thing for planning. You have like some simple representations of where it should be in primitive state space. You use that to create some like higher order abstract plan in a hierarchical reinforcement learning setting, and that tells you what other primitive states you have to go through. So these can be direct connections or they can be indirect. We're not going to be able to test that because we're not doing connectomics, we're just doing functional connectivity. Someone in the back? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I think I have two answers to that question. So the first one is in the case where you're doing explicit search or explicit rollouts. As long as your model is well calibrated so you can capture the uncertainty in the world, then you should still be okay. It's in the same vein as if you're doing reinforcement learning in stochastic environments. As long as you can sample from the environment, then you can compute unbiased estimates of your gradients. And in the same way, when you're doing reinforcement learning from imagined experience, if you can sample from your environment, you can compute gradients of the reward function with respect to the hidden state of your RNN, and you should be able to do policy improvements. In this prefrontal cortex planning algorithm, right, we've assumed that you just have like a binary adjacency matrix. These actions are allowed and these actions are not allowed.